Our Syrian crisis, because MPs recalled to Westminster will be debating that crisis today and will be voting on the principle of military action.
Labour has indicated it may still not back the government. It's pressing ahead with its own motion calling for compelling evidence that President Assad did use chemical weapons before any military action is taken.
Well, the government is preparing to publish its own legal advice in the next hour on intelligence outlining whether poison gas was fired on civilians in Damascus. Let's join our correspondent Yolande Nell, who's following events in Syria from neighbouring Lebanon. Let's just pick up on those weapons inspectors, because we now know when they're coming out. What do we know about their activities today, Yolande?
Well, a short time ago, we saw them leaving in convoy once again from their hotel in the centre of Damascus, heading out for their third day of on-site visits to areas affected by last week's suspected poison gas attack. From activists, we know that they went yesterday to the eastern part of Damascus, to the Routa area, which was at the centre of these suspected chemical weapons attacks, and they've already been to another area called Muadamiyah, which is to the west of the city, and Ban Ki-moon has said that they've collected valuable samples, biological and environmental samples. We understand they've been meeting doctors, patients and also witnesses to what happened. But the interesting comments coming now from Mr. Ban in his latest remarks about the timetable of these inspectors. They're going to be finishing work much sooner than we had previously expected. They'll basically be finishing work tomorrow, we now understand. They'll be heading out of Damascus on Saturday, and then very soon afterwards they will be presenting their report on their findings about whether chemical weapons were used to the UN Secretary General, and he's previously said that he would share the findings with the UN Security Council.
With President Obama and British and French leaders supporting punitive action, what do we know about the whereabouts of Bashar al-Assad himself?
Well, there were some reports that he had left the country recently, but those have been strongly denied. If you look at what's been happening inside Damascus in particular at the moment, of course, the heart of Damascus remains firmly in government hands. There have been a lot of reports that people generally, and you can assume that President Assad would be among them, have been leaving government buildings and areas near to military installations because of concern that a military strike could be imminent.
OK, Yolande Nell in Beirut, thank you very much.
Well, with me now is our World Affairs editor, John Simpson. John, this is a very serious situation, but how dangerous is it?
I think it's limited, both in seriousness and in danger. We're not talking about 2003 again. The fact is that in Britain, at any rate, all the arguments are about 2003. You get the feeling that politicians, other people are kind of going through all the things that they perhaps wished they'd said back in 2003 with all the hindsight of 10 years. But it isn't, as far as I can see, anything remotely like that. And the Americans in particular are not very keen on this kind of interventionism under the Obama administration, are going to want to keep it as limited and as small scale as they can. I suspect that they and the French, perhaps the British, although I now have real doubts whether Britain will get involved, will target specifically chemical weapons facilities of different kinds, or what they claim to be. I mean, these are, you know, as we know from 2003, very difficult to know what the intelligence, the reality of what the intelligence is claiming. But they'll do that, and then I suspect they'll want to move away from that as fast as they can.
But will they be able to do that, John? Can you keep it limited? Because as one newspaper columnist was saying this morning, you can't be a little bit pregnant, can you? Once you're in, that's it.
Well, we've just had so much experience of these things. I mean, President Clinton, if you remember, 15 years ago, used to bomb people quite regularly. But we didn't mean to say that the West or that the United States was actually involved in those countries. I suspect that it's not in anybody's interest to go any further than pressing the button for a number of missiles and then saying, OK, we proved our point, now that's it.
John, just a line coming in from Jeremy Byrne in Damascus. He's saying that the Speaker of the Syrian Parliament has written to Mr Berko, here John Berko, Speaker of the House of Commons, inviting a parliamentary delegation to Damascus as soon as possible and bringing their own experts to check UN conclusions. It also says that Syria will sue those responsible in British courts if Britain attacks. It would be an aggressive and unprovoked act of war. What do you make of the strategy here of Bashar al-Assad compared, for example, to Saddam Hussein and other people in terms of dealing with somebody like this and the responses and the whole choreography of things?
It's very similar because if you are the target for massive, potentially massive international efforts like that, there's not much you can do except to make these kind of points around the place, trying to score debating points, but that's all it is. I mean, it'll be very interesting to see if a British parliamentary team will go. I think they'd be quite nervous about it, actually, but there'll be some, I'm sure, who'll want to go there. Fascinating.
Yeah. So this talk of war and of setting a tinderbox alight in the Middle East, you think that should be downplayed?
I do, simply because everybody is so nervous about it. I mean, the British are clearly very nervous. I know the French are anxious about it, and but the Americans privately say they are too. It's just that, I mean, from their point of view, this is their argument. If you've had something as evil as a chemical warfare attack, it's not sufficient to just say, well, we'll have to hope it doesn't happen again. There has to be some response to it. Okay, of course, this is also rhetoric, and Saddam Hussein used chemical warfare against Iran, and people chose not to take any notice at all, and that was done often with American sort of tacit support. So I'm not suggesting this is a logical or a straightforward argument, but that is the argument that people are using at the moment.
John, many thanks for coming in. Thank you.
Well, let's go to Leeds now. We can speak to Alistair Hay, Professor of Environmental Toxicology at Leeds University, an expert in chemicals used in warfare. We now hear that this team is coming out on Saturday. Will they have had long enough to gather the samples and evidence that they require?
Yes, absolutely. They will have taken samples from patients, and we've heard that. They will have taken their environmental samples as well. I'm almost certain they'll have everything they need.
And what is the time frame in terms of the analysis of those samples?
Well, you probably want a couple of days for analysis of biological samples. It very much depends on how many they have. And something similar for the environmental samples too. The time scale will largely be dictated by the sheer number of samples that they've got to look at.
And degradation, how long? I mean, what is your thought about the images you've seen? What sort of chemical do you think would have been used, and what sort of degradation process is there with that?
Well, all the evidence points to something like a nerve agent. These are part of a family of chemicals called organophosphates, and they all display a similar all have a similar sort of effect, except the nerve gases are extremely potent organophosphates. All of the images I've seen, all of the interviews I've seen with doctors, and the treatment that's being given to people point to some kind of nerve gas. We don't know which one yet. It may be sarin. Governments have been talking about some earlier investigations and saying they've found sarin in some samples from individuals who've been affected. So it may be sarin or something else. The degradation time sort of varies. But I've been involved in work in Iraq where we found evidence from environmental samples 4 years after these weapons were used. And this was mustard gas and sarin. So there is plenty of time yet for these samples to be tested and for positive results to be found.
And if it is something like sarin, are there any real health risks for those people who've been affected but have survived now?
Yes, there could certainly be. Some of the individuals who may have had restricted breathing may have, as a result of that, had an effect on their brain function. And so some of these individuals may have permanent damage. What concerns me is that there's been a lot of rhetoric about punishment, but less about the treatment of the people who've been affected. and many of these individuals will need substantial treatment for quite some time. So I'm concerned about medical resources being provided for the individuals affected as well.
OK, Alistair Hay, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Well, Martin Horwood is a Liberal Democrat MP for Cheltenham, and he joins me live from Westminster. Mr Horwood, good morning to you. What is your feeling about attacking Syria?
Well, I think the use of chemical weapons is something which plumbs new depths of barbarity even for the Syrian conflict. This is something that's been outlawed or ruled against in international conventions since just after the First World War. And it really does demand a strong response from the international community. Now the question is what and how, and I think John Simpson was absolutely right. People are looking over their shoulders at what happened over Iraq, but he's also right that there are many differences. This is something which the government has made clear. They're going to put out a strong, clear legal case, which wasn't done over Iraq. They're going to gather regional support as far as possible, international support, possible a UN mandate, which wasn't done over Iraq, and we're going to see a more limited approach. And in that way, it's more comparable, if you like, to Libya, where there was a specific intervention to prevent the massacres at Benghazi, but the coalition is no longer in Libya. We're not in Libya only 2 years later. A stark contrast to Iraq again.
Now, your leader was opposed to the Iraq war, but he does seem to be, well, not in favour of military action, but he is saying that it wouldn't necessarily mean boots on the ground. It would be short, sharp, and it could be managed. Would you agree with that?
It's not only not necessarily boots on the ground, it's not boots on the ground at all. That's not what anybody is talking about here. We're talking about a limited strike, probably missile-based, which would be a specific response to the use of chemical weapons and designed to prevent their further use. That would be the objective. We're not talking about regime change, we're not talking about invasions or anything like that. We are talking about a very specific case of responding to the use of chemical weapons, which is a clear breach of international law. And I think many MPs, quite rightly, Liberal Democrats very much amongst them, have been nervous about doing this without pursuing the UN route, without letting the weapons inspectors finish their work, and that's why the government motion has been framed in the way that it has been, and with even a second vote of Parliament before actual British involvement in any military action is agreed.
A lot of your supporters, Liberal Democrats, listening to this may be very nervous hearing you speak, because you're not ruling out some sort of military action. And, you know, I would imagine that some of your core support comes from people who would be totally against this sort of thing.
Well, remember, Liberal Democrats did support NATO action in Bosnia because the humanitarian case was so strong. And that was military action, actually, at the time, without UN endorsement, because, again, Russia was a blocking vote on the Security Council. And we have to think back to parallels like Rwanda, where the international community stood aside and did absolutely nothing. And I think Liberal Democrat supporters hate dictatorships. They hate humanitarian abuse. They hate the breaching of international law by dictators like Assad in the use of chemical weapons. But you're right, many people in the party in Parliament are very nervous about this kind of intervention and want to make sure that we have got a good legal case, that there is regional backing as far as possible, and that we are talking about something that is specific and limited. And the government has bent over backwards to accommodate those concerns, and trying to accommodate the concerns from the Labour Party as well, although slightly mystifying now that Labour, having not done any of these things in the case of Iraq 10 years ago, is now taking a very confused position over this now.
Martin Horwood, many thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
9:49, you're watching BBC News After Headlines this morning. MPs will be debating the crisis on Syria today in a special session of Parliament, with Labour signalling it may not back a new watered-down government motion.
In the US, President Barack Obama says no decision has been made on action, but he believes the Syrian government carried out last week's chemical weapons attack.